What if I told you that almost everything you believe about Vikings, pirates and knights is completely made up? The horned helmets, walking the plank, the lifelong code of chivalry. Hollywood and books have given us vivid, unforgettable images, but how much of it is actually true? In this video, we're going to break down exactly 50 of the biggest myths and misconceptions about these legendary figures of the past. We're going to dig deep into history to separate fact from fiction. Get ready, because some of these revelations will truly shock you and force you to look at these stories, familiar since childhood, in a whole new light. What myth did you believe was true your entire life? Let us know in the comments before we even begin. It will be fascinating to compare notes at the end. Vikings, pirates, knights. These words conjure up an avalanche of images. Brutal raiders, desperate sea dogs, and noble warriors in shining armour. But why have they become such iconic figures? It's largely thanks to the romanticism of the 19th century, and of course the cinema of the 20th. Writers and directors took real historical figures and heavily embellished their images, making them more heroic, villainous, or mysterious. As a result, truth and fiction became so tightly interwoven that today they are almost impossible to distinguish. Our mission is to untangle this knot. We'll start with the fierce warriors of the north, the Vikings, then we'll hoist the Jolly Roger with the pirates, and finally, we'll finish our breakdown in a medieval castle among the knights. So, let's embark on this voyage through the waves of history. Let's start with arguably the most famous image. Picture a Viking. What do you see? Almost certainly a mighty, bearded warrior wearing a helmet with horns. This image is so deeply ingrained in our culture that it's nearly impossible to imagine a Viking without it. It's everywhere, in movies, cartoons, and on sports team logos. But here is the shocking truth. Archaeologists have never, and I repeat, never, found a single Viking helmet with horns. This myth emerged much later, in the 19th century. An artist named Carl Emil Doppler was designing costumes for a production of Wagner's opera Der Ring der Nibelungen, and decided to add some drama to the warriors by affixing horns to their headgear. The audience loved the look, and the image stuck. In reality, Viking helmets were far more practical. They were usually simple, conical, or hemispherical iron helmets, sometimes featuring protection for the nose and cheeks, like the famous Geirmundbu helmet. Wearing horns into battle would have been suicidal. They would have easily snagged on an opponent's weapon, and one solid strike could have simply snapped your neck. So a real Viking, seeing one of his comrades wearing a horned helmet, would likely have just shaken his head in disbelief. The next popular myth suggests that Vikings were nothing more than filthy, unwashed barbarians. In movies, they are often depicted wearing ragged furs, with mud smeared across their faces and tangled in their hair, a marauding horde of savages bringing nothing but destruction. However, archaeological findings paint a completely different picture. At Viking settlement sites, archaeologists find huge numbers of combs, tweezers, razors, and even specialised ear spoons. These items were crafted from bone or antler and were often beautifully decorated. Even the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, written by their enemies, remarked with surprise that the Danes, meaning the Vikings, combed their hair every day, bathed every Saturday, and regularly changed their clothes. Compared to the local populace, they likely seemed incredibly fastidious about cleanliness. They also highly valued brightly coloured clothing and jewellery. So, the image of the savage in filthy furs can safely be relegated to fantasy novels. Real Vikings paid serious attention to their hygiene and appearance. It's often said that Viking was the name of an entire people, synonymous with Scandinavian, but that's not quite accurate. The word Viking actually referred not to a nationality, but to an occupation or profession. A Viking was someone who embarked on a Viking, that is, a sea voyage undertaken for the purpose of raiding or trading. The majority of Scandinavians during the Viking Age, farmers, artisans and merchants, never went on these voyages and were not Vikings themselves. What's more, not all Vikings were even Scandinavian. Their crews could include Slavs, Balts, and Finns. It was more of an international brotherhood of warriors and adventurers. A man might be a Viking in his youth and then return home, buy land, and settle down as an ordinary farmer. Therefore, calling every resident of Scandinavia from that era a Viking is like calling every 15th century Italian a condottiero. It's a massive oversimplification. One of the most gruesome myths surrounding the Vikings involves a ritual execution known as the Blood Eagle. Legends claim the Vikings would slice open the victim's back, snap the ribs, and pull the lungs outside the body, creating the terrifying visual of a pair of bloody wings. This horrific image is often used in modern media to emphasize Viking brutality. However, most contemporary historians now agree that the Blood Eagle is more likely a literary invention than an actual practice. Mentions of the practice only appear in the sagas, which were written down centuries after the events they describe, and are full of poetic exaggeration. There is no archaeological evidence of this specific execution, nor are there any first-hand accounts from the period. It was likely just a terrifying tale, a gruesome piece of Viking propaganda created by the Skalds to underscore the power and ruthlessness of their heroes. Real Viking executions were certainly cruel, but they were far more mundane, typically hanging, beheading, or drowning. Another vivid yet completely false image is that of Vikings drinking from their enemies' skulls. This image is deeply ingrained in popular culture as a prime symbol of their alleged barbarity. The myth originated due to a simple translation error. The error traces back to a 16th century Danish poem describing a feast in Valhalla, where the warriors were said to be drinking from the curved branches of skulls. This poetic phrasing actually referred to standard drinking horns, which of course sprout from the heads of animals. However, a translator took the phrase literally, and that is how this gruesome custom became a lasting legend. While the Vikings certainly weren't vegetarians or committed pacifists, using human remains as tableware was simply not their tradition. For their feasts, they relied on beautifully crafted wooden and clay bowls, and perhaps most famously, intricately decorated drinking horns. Some of these horns were true works of art, often fitted with silver or other precious metals. The common perception is that the Vikings were nothing more than savage raiders and warriors whose only mission was sailing the seas and burning monasteries. While raiding was undoubtedly a crucial part of their existence, it represents only one side of the coin. In reality, the Vikings were also skilled traders, explorers, and pioneering colonizers. Their vast trading network stretched from the edges of North America all the way to Baghdad. They exchanged furs, amber, walrus ivory, and even slaves for valuable goods such as silver, silk, spices, and glass. They were responsible for founding major settlements, including Dublin in Ireland, and established what would become Kievan Rus, in line with the controversial Normanist theory. Crucially, they were the first Europeans to reach the shores of North America, arriving 5 centuries before Christopher Columbus. Their society was governed by a complex set of laws. They established sophisticated regional assemblies, known as the Things, where freemen debated and decided crucial political matters. Therefore, reducing the entirety of their civilization simply to acts of plunder is to severely underestimate their profound contribution to world history. There's a common myth that women in Viking society were completely powerless, confined solely to domestic duties and raising children. That couldn't be further from the truth. Compared to many other European societies of that era, Scandinavian women enjoyed surprisingly extensive rights. They could own land, inherit property, and even demand a divorce if their husband mistreated them. When a husband left on a raid or a journey, the woman became the undisputed head of the household, managing all the property and affairs. The symbol of this authority was the set of keys that married women traditionally wore on their belts. But what about the female warriors, the legendary shield maidens? For a long time, they were dismissed as purely mythological figures. However, recent archaeological discoveries, such as the weapon-filled warrior grave in Burka, which genetic analysis proved belonged to a woman, are forcing scholars to reconsider this viewpoint. It appears that female warriors may not have been the rarity we once assumed. Many people imagine that any Viking ship is a longship or a drakar, but the truth is, the drakar was only one specific type, and the largest, of warship they employed. Its name translates to dragon ship, owing to the carved dragon's head on the bow, which was meant to ward off evil spirits and intimidate enemies. These were the flagships of the fleet, typically belonging to kings, or konungs, and the most powerful jarls. However, the Vikings utilised many other types of vessels. For example, the snekja, or snake, was a lighter, more manoeuvrable warship that formed the backbone of the fleet. For trade and cargo transport, they relied on knarrs, wider, deeper, and far more capacious ships built specifically for crossing the open ocean. It was aboard these knarrs that the Vikings sailed to Iceland, Greenland, and even North America. All of these vessels were true masterpieces of naval engineering for their era. Their construction, featuring clinker planking and a flexible keel, made them simultaneously strong, swift, and highly versatile, able to navigate both the open sea and shallow inland rivers. The typical image of a Viking is that of a huge, blonde-haired, blue-eyed giant. This stereotype was actually perpetuated largely by Nazi propaganda, which tried to paint them as the perfect model for the so-called Aryan race. In reality, Vikings were far more diverse in appearance. While there were certainly many blondes among them, they had just as many redheads and dark-haired individuals. Archaeological studies of human remains show that the average height of a Viking male was about 170 centimetres. While this was relatively tall for the era, it certainly didn't make them giants. Furthermore, their raiding parties included people from different nations, adding even more variety to their overall look. Fascinatingly, some dark-haired Vikings, particularly the men, actually used a special alkaline paste to lighten their hair and beards to a striking platinum blonde shade. This practice was considered highly fashionable and may also have held ritualistic significance. The notion that all Vikings were pagans devoted solely to Odin and Thor is only partly accurate. The Viking Age, spanning roughly from the 8th to the 11th century, was a time of profound transformation, particularly in religious belief. While the vast majority of Scandinavians were polytheists at the very start of the era, the new Christian faith gradually began to filter northward as their interactions with Christian Europe increased. The conversion process was lengthy, often violent, and rarely straightforward. Many Vikings adopted Christianity for purely pragmatic reasons, be it for political stability or simply to facilitate better trade relations with their European neighbours. For a significant period, both religions coexisted side by side. Archaeologists frequently uncover amulets where the Christian cross is worn right alongside Mjolnir, Thor's hammer. However, by the 11th century, marking the formal close of the Viking Age, most major Scandinavian kingdoms had officially adopted the Christian faith. Therefore, the quintessential image of the purely pagan Viking truly belongs only to the early decades of the era. Let's step aboard a pirate ship for a moment. What's the most infamous punishment for those who step out of line? Making the unlucky victim walk the plank, of course. We've seen the scene hundreds of times. Blindfolded, guns pressed to their backs, taking those last terrifying steps over shark-infested waters. It sounds brutal and perfectly pirate. The truth is, though, this practice was almost never used in real life. That image was largely popularised in literature, specifically in Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. Throughout the historical records of the Golden Age of Piracy, roughly the late 17th to the early 18th century, mentions of walking the plank are incredibly rare, perhaps even solitary incidents. Pirates had far quicker and more efficient ways to dispatch prisoners. More commonly, captives or mutineers were simply thrown overboard, killed outright, or, as a special sort of mercy, marooned on a deserted island with a bottle of water and a pistol holding one bullet. This grim practice was called marooning. So the plank is much more of a dramatic Hollywood trope designed to raise tension than a genuine pirate practice. Another essential pirate attribute is the treasure map, marked with a bold X, indicating where the chest of gold lies buried. X marks the spot. This phrase became iconic. Unfortunately, this too is largely a literary invention, heavily popularized, once again, by Treasure Island. Real pirates almost never buried their loot. Why would they? It was completely illogical. They needed the money right here and now to spend on rum, women, and entertainment in pirate strongholds like Tortuga or Port Royal. The spoils, which they called the prize, were typically divided among the crew immediately after capturing a ship, according to the shares outlined in the pirate code. Stashing it in the ground was risky, you could die, and your treasure would never be found. The only known instance of a pirate actually burying a treasure was Captain William Kidd. He did so out of desperation, hoping to use the trove later as leverage for his defense. In the end, he was hanged anyway, and the discovery of his small cache merely fueled the imagination of treasure hunters for centuries to come. The image of the one-eyed pirate wearing a black patch is an absolute classic. Conventionally, we assume the patch was worn by those who had lost an eye in battle. While that certainly happened, the patch actually served another, far more practical purpose. Now imagine fighting aboard a ship. Pirates constantly move between the sun-drenched deck and the dark, virtually unlit interior spaces, like the ship's hold. Our eyes need time to adjust to such dramatic shifts in lighting. And this is exactly where the eye patch came into play. The eye, kept hidden under the patch, remained constantly adapted to the darkness. When descending into the hold, a pirate would simply slide the patch over to the other eye. This allowed them to instantly see clearly in the dim light, granting a crucial tactical advantage in a fight. So the eye patch wasn't just a sign of injury, it was essentially the 17th century equivalent of a night vision device. The Jolly Roger, that classic black flag featuring the skull and crossbones, has become the universal symbol of piracy. However, it's a common misconception that all pirates flew the exact same flag. In reality, many notorious captains designed their own unique standards. Take Blackbeard, for instance. His flag featured a skeleton spearing a heart and holding an hourglass, a clear warning that said, "Your time is up." Calico Jack Rackham opted for a simple skull above two cross cutlasses. Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart, went a step further, depicting himself standing atop two skulls, said to represent the heads of the governors who hunted him. Furthermore, pirates didn't always start a confrontation flying the black flag. When closing in on a target, they often used a decoy, raising the flag of a friendly nation to approach unnoticed and eliminate suspicion. Only at the last possible moment, when escape was impossible, would they dramatically hoist their true pirate colours. This was primarily a psychological tactic. The black flag was an invitation to surrender peacefully. If, however, they raised the red flag, it was a terrifying signal that no quarter would be given, meaning everyone aboard would be killed. The image of a parrot perched on a pirate's shoulder is yet another trope we owe to Treasure Island, and its character, Long John Silver, and his famous bird, Captain Flint. Of course, sailors, pirates included, frequently brought back exotic animals like monkeys and parrots from foreign shores. These creatures could often be sold for a good profit back in Europe. However, having a bird sitting on your shoulder during a battle or while handling the rigging would have been incredibly inconvenient and downright dangerous. The parrot could easily panic, dig its claws in, or distract the pirate at the worst possible time. Therefore, if pirates owned parrots at all, they were most likely kept in cages, either as valuable cargo to be traded or simply for entertainment while docked, rather than serving as a constant companion in action. The image of a pirate and his parrot is a charming and romanticised detail, but it was almost certainly not common practice in reality. Most people picture pirate ships as massive, heavily armed frigates. Think the Black Pearl from Pirates of the Caribbean. The reality, however, is that the vast majority of pirates favoured vessels that were smaller, faster, and far more agile. The perfect pirate vessel was typically a sloop or a schooner. Because these ships had a shallow draft, they could easily navigate coastal waters, hide in small coves, and slip away from pursuing naval vessels, which often found themselves stranded on sandbars. Speed and suddenness, not brute firepower, were the pirates' primary weapons. They strategically avoided prolonged cannon duels, preferring instead to swiftly close the distance, board the target merchant vessel, and secure the prize through hand-to-hand combat. Furthermore, larger ships demanded bigger crews, extensive provisions, and were simply more challenging to manage, all of which made them inefficient and uneconomical for the practical business of piracy. We often hear the romantic myth of the pirate code, a noble set of rules supposedly adhered to by all gentlemen of fortune. The truth is, a single, unified code never existed. However, every pirate ship did have its own detailed set of rules, known historically as the Articles of Agreement. Before setting sail, the entire crew would either sign this document or mark it with their X. The articles clearly outlined behaviour on the ship and the system of penalties for misdeeds, such as stealing from a shipmate or displaying cowardice in battle. Crucially, they also dictated the precise distribution of future loot. The captain usually received a double or a share and a half. The quartermaster, who was the crew's elected representative, received a similar bonus. Everyone else received a single share. Provisions were also made for compensation for injuries. Losing a hand or leg, for example, guaranteed a specific sum paid directly from the common treasure. So rather than being a glorious code of honour, the articles were really a pragmatic working contract designed purely to maintain discipline and order aboard the vessel. Movies often show pirates expertly duelling with thin, elegant rapiers. While this looks very elegant, such a weapon was impractical during a chaotic boarding fight on a cramped, rocking deck. Rapiers are best suited for one-on-one duels with plenty of space to manoeuvre. The pirate's primary weapon, however, was the short, heavy, and wide cutlass. It was much easier to wield in close quarters, allowing the user to not only stab, but also deliver powerful hacking blows. The heavy blade could easily slice through ropes and rigging and penetrate light armour or clothing. In addition to the cutlass, pirates heavily relied on pistols. Since these were single-shot weapons, pirates often carried several, tucked into their belts. Once fired, the pistol effectively became a crude club. Other weapons used included axes, knives, and hand grenades, small fused cast-iron balls. Rum was undoubtedly the beverage of choice for pirates and sailors of that age. However, the popular myth that they drank it constantly and in massive quantities is somewhat exaggerated. Aboard a ship, especially during long voyages, fresh water would rapidly spoil and become undrinkable. To purify it and improve the flavour, they routinely added alcohol, usually rum or beer. The resulting drink was known as grog. It was fairly mild and formed part of the crew's daily ration. Certainly, when ashore in port, pirates might carouse and drink themselves senseless, blowing through their share of the plunder. But while at sea, especially before battle, the captain and the quartermaster strictly enforced discipline. Drunkenness while on watch or before an engagement was severely punished, as the lives of everyone depended entirely on the crew's sobriety and coordinated actions. Movies have created the common stereotype that all pirates were either English or at the very least Spanish. In reality, the pirate community was astonishingly diverse and multinational. A single ship could host crew members who were English, French, Dutch, Portuguese, Irish, Scots, and even former slaves from Africa. For many runaway slaves and indentured servants, piracy was the only real chance to find freedom and equality. Aboard a pirate vessel, your skin colour or native language didn't matter. What truly counted was your skill in battle and adherence to the ship's Articles of Agreement. This created a unique melting pot, where people of vastly different nationalities and social backgrounds united for one common goal: profit. This made pirate crews some of the most internationally diverse communities of their era. In popular culture, pirates are often depicted as chaotic rebels, defying all forms of authority. This is partly true, but it's crucial to understand the difference between a pirate and a privateer. A privateer was essentially a legal pirate. They received a special document from their government, a letter of marque, which authorised them to attack the ships of hostile nations during wartime. The privateer would then share the spoils with the treasury. Many famous figures, often labelled as pirates, such as Sir Francis Drake or Captain Henry Morgan, actually spent the majority of their careers as privateers in the service of the English crown. Once the war ended, the letter of marque automatically became void. Some captains returned to a quiet civilian life. Others, however, were unwilling to abandon such a profitable trade and continued robbing ships at their own risk, finally becoming genuine pirates, criminals in the eyes of every nation. The common perception is that piracy was exclusively a male domain. However, history provides several examples of notorious female pirates who were every bit as capable as their male counterparts. The most famous among them are Anne Bonny and Mary Read, who sailed under the command of Calico Jack Rackham. They often dressed in men's clothing, were masterfully skilled with weapons, and were notorious for their courage and brutality in combat. When their ship was finally captured, only Bonny, Read, and one other pirate resisted the boarding party, while the rest of the crew was too drunk to fight. Both women were sentenced to hang, but they successfully avoided execution by pleading their bellies, claiming to be pregnant. Their ultimate fates remain largely unknown. Another legendary figure is the Chinese pirate Qing Shi, or Madame Zheng, who, in the early 19th century, commanded an immense pirate fleet consisting of hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of personnel. She became so powerful that the Chinese government eventually offered her a full amnesty in exchange for agreeing to cease her raids and retire from piracy. The common belief that pirates spoke with a specific, rolling accent using phrases like "yo-ho-ho" and "ahoy there, shiver me timbers," or similar dramatic exclamations, is actually thanks to actor Robert Newton. In the 1950s, Newton played Long John Silver in the film Treasure Island and invented a characteristic accent for the character, which was based on the dialect of his native West Country in England. Audiences loved this portrayal so much that it quickly became the standard Hollywood depiction of pirates. In reality, as we've discussed, pirate crews were highly multinational, meaning ships were filled with a cacophony of different accents and languages. There was no single, unified pirate way of speaking. It is simply another colourful flourish added by cinema to romanticize the image of the sea rogue. In adventure novels, pirates often kidnap noble ladies and governors' daughters to demand hefty ransoms. In reality, pirates generally tried to avoid taking women aboard their ships. Many pirate vessels had specific clauses within their Articles of Agreement, their internal code, explicitly forbidding women from being brought onto the vessel. It was widely believed that this practice brought bad luck, and, more importantly, in an exclusively male environment, it often sparked jealousy, conflict, and serious quarrels among the crew. Pirates did take prisoners, but they were usually individuals who proved immediately useful, skilled carpenters, doctors, or navigators they could compel to serve the crew. The only other acceptable captives were high-ranking officials or wealthy merchants from whom a genuinely substantial ransom could be extracted. Kidnapping women was simply too cumbersome and risky a business, offering little financial reward in return. It's a common misconception that all pirates were ruthless, bloodthirsty murderers who showed no mercy. Of course, there were sadists among them, figures like Edward Lowe, who famously enjoyed torture. But for the vast majority of pirates, violence wasn't an end in itself. It was simply a tool. Their primary objective was to capture the ship and its cargo with the fewest possible losses on their own side. That's why they actively cultivated a terrifying image. The black flag, the wild screams, the fearsome weaponry, all of this was part of a psychological attack designed to make the merchant crew surrender without a fight. If the target surrendered immediately, they were usually left unharmed. The pirates would take the valuables and let them go. Cruelty was generally reserved for those who actively resisted. The rumours of pirate ruthlessness worked entirely to their advantage. It ensured that the next time, merchant captains would think twice before choosing to engage. Let's transport ourselves back to the Middle Ages, to the time of noble knights. In our minds, they are always encased in mirror-polished plate armour, gleaming brightly. Whether riding to a tournament or embarking on a crusade, the sun catches and reflects off their polished steel. That's a beautiful image, but it's not entirely accurate. For starters, full plate armour, the kind that covers the entire body, only became truly widespread in the late Middle Ages, roughly starting in the 15th century. Before that time, knights typically wore chainmail helmets and scattered metal plates to guard the most vulnerable areas. Secondly, armour wasn't always shiny. Far from it. Polishing metal to a brilliant sheen was an incredibly laborious and time-consuming process. In real combat situations, armour would quickly become marred by dirt, rust, and dents. This gleaming appearance was mostly reserved for parades, tournaments, or moments when a knight specifically wanted to impress. In fact, armour was often blued or blackened, a process involving coating the steel with a layer of iron oxide to protect it from corrosion. This treated armour would appear dark blue or matte black. There is a persistent myth that medieval plate armour was incredibly heavy and cumbersome, rendering the wearer practically immobile, so much so that if a knight fell off his horse, he couldn't possibly stand up again on his own. This is a gross exaggeration. Yes, a full suit of combat plate armour certainly wasn't light, typically weighing between 20 and 30 kilograms, or roughly 45 to 65 pounds. However, that weight was extremely well distributed across the entire body, unlike a modern soldier's heavy pack, which tends to put all the stress solely on the shoulders. A properly fitted suit of armour barely restricted movement at all. The wearer could run, jump, tumble, and, most importantly, stand up easily from the ground without assistance. Numerous historical accounts and modern reenactment experiments prove this fact conclusively. Difficulties only arose if a knight was knocked down in deep mud or water, or if he had sustained a serious injury. But the weight of the armour itself never turned the warrior into a helpless, flipped-over turtle. Tournament armour, designed strictly for jousting, was indeed much heavier than combat gear, but it was built for entirely different purposes. We're used to thinking of knights as noble defenders of the weak and oppressed, strictly adhering to codes of honour and chivalry. This idealised image was largely created by medieval literature and romanticised tales. In reality, things were far more complicated. Yes, an ideal code of chivalric conduct did exist, which involved loyalty to one's liege, bravery in battle, defence of the church, and showing mercy, but usually only to enemies of equal social standing. In practice, however, many knights were simply professional soldiers, brutal and pragmatic. Off the battlefield, they routinely robbed peasants, engaged in highway banditry, and behaved in ways that were anything but gentlemanly. This was especially true for the so-called Raubritters, the robber knights of Germany. Furthermore, the concept of courtly love and serving the fair maiden was often more of a literary fantasy than a real behavioural guide. Crucially, chivalrous treatment primarily extended to other nobles. It rarely, if ever, applied to commoners or the lower classes. Movies and books often portray knightly tournaments as brutal, winner-take-all contests where knights fight to the death solely for the crowd's entertainment. In reality, classic tournaments were much closer to a sophisticated sporting event, the medieval equivalent of Formula One racing. Their primary goal wasn't the death of the opponent, but rather a chance to display valour, demonstrate superior weaponry skills, and earn money. While injuries, and occasionally even deaths, did occur, these were generally considered accidents. They used special, blunted tournament weapons. The main event was the joust, where the goal was either to unseat the opponent or shatter your lance against his shield. The defeated knight had to surrender his armour and horse to the victor, a tremendously expensive penalty. This made tournaments a vital way for less wealthy knights to dramatically improve their financial standing. Fatal duels, fought to the death, certainly existed, but these belonged to a separate category of judicial combats, not recreational tournaments. The romantic image of a knight rescuing a damsel in distress from the clutches of a dragon or an evil baron is one of history's most enduring myths. This storyline was central to countless chivalric romances. In reality, however, marriage within medieval noble society was primarily a political and economic union. They were arranged by parents to consolidate land, forge alliances, or secure a valuable dowry. The feelings of the young man and woman rarely factored into the decision. Of course, this is not to say love didn't exist, but it was certainly not the foundation upon which a marriage was built. Furthermore, the supposed rescue of a noblewoman was often just the violent abduction of an heiress designed to force a marriage and gain control of her property. This was a surprisingly common crime throughout the medieval period. So, the reality of the era was starkly different from the romantic ballads. A lot of people think that the term knight is just another way of saying medieval warrior in shining armour. However, knighthood was far more than just a job. It was a specific social status, essentially comprising the lower ranks of the feudal aristocracy. Becoming a knight required a long and rigorous journey. A boy from a noble family first served as a page in a lord's court, learning proper manners, chivalry, and the foundations of military training. Later, usually in his teens, he advanced to the role of squire. He was tasked with serving a specific knight, maintaining his horse and armour, and accompanying him into battle. Only after proving himself worthy and competent could he finally be dubbed a knight. The knighting ceremony itself was a deeply significant ritual. The candidate would traditionally spend a night in prayer, known as a vigil, before the Lord would strike him lightly on the shoulder with the flat of a sword, reciting the formal oath. It's crucial to remember that not every nobleman became a knight, and conversely, not every armoured warrior held that title. There were numerous common men-at-arms and mercenaries who were certainly fighters in armour, but they never belonged to the established chivalric order. Hollywood often shows knights wielding massive two-handed swords, effortlessly slicing enemies in half. Swords like the Zweihander or claymore certainly existed, but they were never a knight's primary weapon. Instead, these were highly specialised weapons carried primarily by Landsknecht foot soldiers, designed specifically to break up formations of pikemen. The typical knightly sword was a true one-handed weapon, usually about 90 centimetres long and weighing just over a kilogram. It was perfectly balanced, allowing for effective cutting and thrusting, whether fighting mounted or on foot. The other hand, of course, held a shield. Later, as plate armour became more advanced, the hand and a half or bastard sword gained popularity. These could be used effectively with either one or two hands. But even these were nowhere near the gigantic, unwieldy blades that Hollywood continues to portray. The right of the first night, or jus primae noctis, refers to the alleged privilege of a feudal lord to spend the first wedding night with the bride of any of his vassals or peasants. This practice is often cited as a prime example of the cruelty and arbitrary power wielded by medieval seigneurs. However, the overwhelming majority of modern medieval historians agree that this right never actually existed in any codified legal form. There is no law or documentary evidence supporting the existence of this custom. Instead, it is widely considered a black legend, a myth likely created during the Age of Enlightenment specifically to denounce the Dark Ages and attack the foundations of the feudal system. Of course, a powerful lord could and often did abuse his authority, coercing women into non-consensual relations. But these were acts of violence and tyranny, not sanctioned legal privileges. A more plausible origin story lies in the known existence of a marriage tax, a monetary fee paid by the peasant to the lord for permission to wed. Scholars suggest this required payment may have later been misinterpreted or deliberately recast as a symbolic replacement for the mythical right of the first night. It's a common belief that knights scorned bows and crossbows, viewing them as ignoble or cowardly weapons because they allowed a commoner to kill a noble warrior from a safe distance. That assertion holds some truth. Ideologically, knights always favoured close-quarters combat, a venue where they could truly display personal valour. The Catholic Church even attempted to ban the use of crossbows against fellow Christians. However, in practice, knights were pragmatists. They fully understood the efficacy of ranged weapons and utilised them extensively. Many knights and nobles were skilled archers and crossbowmen themselves, particularly when hunting. Furthermore, during the Crusades, Europeans quickly learned to appreciate the power of Saracen bows. Therefore, despite any ideological reservations, in real warfare, knights never shied away from bows or crossbows. They regularly employed entire companies of archers and utilised them effectively to support their cavalry charges and infantry manoeuvres. The chastity belt is a chilling device that, according to popular lore, knights supposedly forced upon their wives before embarking on long crusades or campaigns, all to guarantee their fidelity. The image of this locked, metal contraption has become deeply embedded in culture as a stark symbol of medieval misogyny and control. However, much like the myth of droit du seigneur, the right of the first knight, historians now largely dismiss the chastity belt as fiction. There is simply no reliable evidence that such devices were genuinely used during the Middle Ages. In fact, most of the chastity belts displayed in museums have been proven to be elaborate 19th century fakes. The entire concept is medically absurd. Wearing such a device continuously would have rapidly led to severe infections and serious health complications. Most likely, the chastity belt is a later invention, perhaps starting as a metaphor or even a satirical image that was gradually misinterpreted and accepted as historical fact. Thanks to films like Braveheart, we tend to visualize medieval battles as nothing more than a chaotic brawl. Two mobs of soldiers simply charging and hacking at each other without any organization. In reality, medieval military leaders were highly skilled in both tactics and strategy. Battles were meticulously planned, and armies were always deployed in specific, predetermined formations. Typically, infantry held the center, while the cavalry was positioned on the flanks. Commanders often utilized reserves which were committed to the fight at the decisive moment. Knightly cavalry served as the primary shock troops. Their famous attack, the heavy cavalry charge, was a terrifying weapon. Knights, riding at full gallop in tight formation, would smash into the enemy lines like a battering ram. However, infantry eventually learned to counter this threat, relying on long pikes and disciplined formations such as the famed Swiss pike square. Therefore, far from being a chaotic slaughter, the medieval battlefield was a complex tactical engagement where victory was ultimately decided by discipline, maneuverability, and skilled leadership. The myth that everyone in the Middle Ages believed the earth was flat is one of history's most enduring misconceptions. It is often used to demonstrate the supposed ignorance of that era. In reality, any educated person in the Middle Ages, from monks to knights, knew the earth was a sphere. The concept of a spherical earth had been known since ancient Greece, thanks to scholars like Aristotle and Ptolemy. Their works were actively studied in medieval universities. The evidence for a sphere was obvious: ships disappearing over the horizon hull first, then mast, the changing position of stars when travelling north or south, and the Earth's round shadow cast on the moon during eclipses. The flat Earth myth was actually invented and popularised in the 19th century by writers who sought to contrast their progressive modern era with the dark and superstitious Middle Ages. The real medieval debates were not about the Earth's shape, but rather its exact size and what lay on the other side of the world. Most people picture medieval castles as gloomy, drafty, and uncomfortable stone boxes. Granted, compared to modern homes, they certainly lacked comfort, but their occupants went to great lengths to make their lives as cosy as possible. In the living quarters, walls were often covered with wooden panelling, plastered and painted in bright colours, or hung with tapestries and carpets. These tapestries weren't just decorative, they also served a crucial role in insulation. Every room featured a large fireplace providing both warmth and light. Floors were covered with tile or wood, and then layered with carpets, or often dried herbs and rushes, which were changed out regularly. The furniture was heavy and strictly functional. Large canopy beds, which also offered protection from drafts, storage chests, sturdy tables and benches. So, life inside a castle wasn't nearly as bleak as it is often portrayed. There's a common misconception that medieval cuisine was primitive and bland. That couldn't be further from the truth, at least when we talk about the nobility. The food prepared for the feudal lords was incredibly complex and sophisticated. They absolutely craved spices imported from the East, including pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and ginger. Spices weren't just a sign of wealth. They were also vital for preserving food and masking the taste of ingredients that weren't always at their freshest. Cooks prepared elaborate dishes like pâtés, roasted birds stuffed inside one another, and brightly coloured jellies. They particularly loved sauces made using a base of wine, vinegar, and herbs. Sugar was prohibitively expensive, so honey was the standard sweetener used instead. The diet of commoners, of course, was much simpler, consisting primarily of porridge, bread, vegetables, and only occasionally meat. Nevertheless, even they made efforts to diversify their meals using wild plants and foraged herbs. Let's turn our attention back to the Vikings and their weaponry. In movies and video games, Vikings are often depicted wielding massive two-handed axes. That kind of axe certainly looks intimidating and brutal. However, much like the popular image of the knight's sword, this is largely an exaggeration. Yes, Vikings absolutely used battle axes. They were popular weapons. But for the most part, these were single-handed axes, often resembling common working tools, but featuring longer handles and narrower blades. The most famous exception was the so-called Danish axe, or Dane axe. This weapon featured a long haft, up to 1.5 meters, and a wide, thin, crescent-shaped blade. This was indeed a weapon meant to be swung with both hands. It was a devastating weapon, capable of cleaving through shields and even armour. But it required significant room to swing, and crucially, it left the warrior completely vulnerable to counterattack. Because of this, most Vikings preferred a more versatile combination, a single-handed axe or sword, paired with a shield. Another persistent myth about Vikings centres on their burial rituals. We often see the dramatic scene in movies. The body of a deceased chieftain is placed in a longship, set adrift, and ignited by a fiery arrow shot from a bow. It's a beautiful and dramatic image, but the reality was quite different. Yes, ship burials did occur, but they were extremely rare and costly rites reserved for the highest-ranking nobles. Crucially, the ship was not burned on the water. Instead, it was buried in the ground, forming a large burial mound or barrow. Along with the deceased, the grave was stocked with weapons, jewellery, tools, and sometimes even sacrificed animals and servants, intended to accompany them into the afterlife. Fiery burials or cremation were also common among the Vikings, but these rituals always took place on land. The remains were collected and interred in an urn. So, the vision of a majestic longship burning out at sea is, unfortunately, another beautiful piece of fiction created by 19th century romantics. Christopher Columbus is often credited as the discoverer of America. However, as we've mentioned, the Vikings beat him to it by 5 centuries. Around 1000 AD, the Icelandic explorer Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, who was the first European to settle Greenland, reached the shores of North America. He named the newly found lands Helluland, meaning flat stone country, Markland or forest country, and Vinland, which translates to either wine country or pasture land. The Vikings even established a small settlement in Vinland. For a long time, these accounts, detailed in the Saga of Eric the Red and the Saga of the Greenlanders, were dismissed as mere legends. But in 1960, archaeologists working at L'Anse aux Meadows on the island of Newfoundland discovered the remains of a Scandinavian settlement. This find completely confirmed the truth of the sagas. The settlement was short-lived, however. The Vikings were ultimately forced to abandon it due to conflicts with the local inhabitants, whom they referred to as the Skraelings. Berserkers were legendary Viking warriors. Sagas describe them fighting in a wild, pain-numbing frenzy, biting their shields and charging enemies completely unarmoured. It was believed they were possessed by the spirit of a bear or a wolf. This image of the trance state warrior remains incredibly popular today, but who were they really? Scientists continue to debate their true identity, and several theories exist. One theory suggests berserkers achieved this state through ritualistic practices and intense self-suggestion. Another posits that they consumed psychoactive substances, such as an infusion made from fly agaric mushrooms. A third version suggests they may have suffered from psychological disorders like epilepsy, where their fits in combat were interpreted as divine fury. Regardless of the cause, berserkers were almost certainly real warriors, perhaps members of specialized martial cults who utilized controlled rage as a tactical tool to completely terrify their enemies. Let's return once again to the topic of pirates. Many people assume the Golden Age of Piracy spanned centuries. In reality, this most famous era of pirate activity was surprisingly brief. Historians generally date this period from roughly 1650 to 1730. However, the true peak of activity, the time when legendary figures like Blackbeard, Calico Jack, and Bartholomew Roberts were most active, lasted for an even shorter span, from about 1716 to 1726, just one single decade. So what fueled this sudden explosion of piracy? Primarily, the trigger was the ending of the War of the Spanish Succession. Thousands of trained privateers and naval sailors were suddenly left jobless. Unwilling to return to poverty, they quickly turned to piracy. This period was brought to an end by the coordinated actions of the major world navies, which began a systematic hunt for the pirates, making the outlaw lifestyle far too dangerous to sustain. Remember that famous scene from Pirates of the Caribbean, where the characters are left stranded on a deserted island? This form of punishment, known as marooning, was a real practice among pirates. They considered it a more humane alternative to outright murder. A disgraced crew member, or the captured captain of an enemy vessel, would be abandoned on a small, uninhabited island, usually located far away from major trade routes. They would leave the victim with a small supply of fresh water, a weapon, often a pistol with a single shot, and sometimes a bottle of rum. The choice was brutal: face a slow death by starvation and thirst, or opt for a quick suicide. While the odds of survival were incredibly slim, they weren't zero. The most famous example is the story of Alexander Selkirk, a Scottish sailor who, ironically, was marooned at his own request after a heated argument with his captain. He survived there alone for over 4 years until a passing ship finally rescued him. His remarkable tale eventually became the inspiration for Daniel Defoe's legendary novel, Robinson Crusoe. It's a common misconception that pirates were all uneducated cutthroats. While most were certainly simple sailors, the ranks of pirate captains included some surprisingly well-educated individuals. Take Bartholomew Roberts, for instance, one of the most successful pirates of all time. He was known for his refined manners, his love of fine clothing, and his appreciation for music. Roberts was actually a teetotaler, and he strictly enforced Sunday services aboard his ship. Then there was William Dampier, who joined pirate crews several times. He was a talented navigator, an explorer, and a prolific writer. His travel books were immensely popular and widely read throughout England. Many pirates, in fact, were excellent cartographers and master navigators. To succeed in their trade, they needed skills like reading complex maps, using sophisticated navigational instruments, and performing detailed calculations. All in all, the pirate community was far from the homogeneous and primitive group we often imagine. We often picture pirates battling enormous Royal Navy warships. Of course, those clashes did happen, and they almost always ended badly for the pirates. But the pirates' main targets weren't warships at all. They were the merchant vessels, the traders. These ships were slow, poorly armed, and filled with valuable cargo: sugar, tobacco, textiles, slaves, and gold. That's exactly what the pirates hunted. Their tactic was simple: choose an isolated, vulnerable target and attack suddenly, taking them by surprise. Engaging a well-armed naval vessel was a senseless risk. Not only did these warships lack valuable cargo, but they also carried hundreds of trained soldiers. Therefore, pirates went to great lengths to avoid any encounters with Navy patrols. Their business was robbery, not war. Let us turn our attention once again to the knights. It is commonly believed that knights, thanks to their heavy armour and rigorous training, were virtually invincible on the battlefield. Yet, the history of the Middle Ages is littered with examples where supposedly superior knightly armies suffered devastating defeats at the hands of seemingly weaker opponents. Take, for instance, the Battle of Courtrai in 1302. There, Flemish militia, armed with pikes and the simple but effective Goedendags, utterly crushed the French mounted forces. Later, at Crécy and Agincourt, English longbowmen systematically decimated the flower of French chivalry with a massive, sustained hail of arrows. Furthermore, Swiss infantry, utilising their deadly formations of halberds and pikes, became the scourge of cavalry across Europe. The knight was indeed a formidable fighting machine, but only when specific conditions were met, primarily on flat, open terrain where their cavalry could achieve maximum charging speed. On broken ground, facing disciplined infantry, or under a sustained barrage of projectiles, the knightly charge often faltered. The steel-clad warriors were then reduced from unstoppable forces to stationary, highly vulnerable targets. Popular culture, through books and films, often depicts the knight as having a single devoted warhorse, a loyal companion through thick and thin. In reality, a wealthy knight owned several horses, each serving a specific function. The principal mount was the warhorse, known as the destrier. This was a massive, powerful and highly trained stallion, specifically bred to bear the weight of a fully armoured rider and remain unflustered by the chaos and noise of battle. These animals were incredibly expensive, often costing a king's ransom, which is why they were fiercely protected in combat. For long marches and daily travel, a different horse was used, the palfrey. This mount was known for being far more enduring and temperamentally calm. During these periods, the precious destrier would be led behind by the knight squire to keep it fresh. Additionally, there were pack horses responsible for carrying the heavy armour, weapons, and all necessary supplies. Clearly, a knight's logistical operation was quite complex, and his horses played an absolutely pivotal role in its success. Consequently, losing a destrier in battle was considered nothing short of a massive personal and financial catastrophe for the knight. We're used to seeing movies where knights lay siege to castles, constructing giant towers and battering rams. Massive sieges like that certainly happened, but they were extremely long, costly, and risky. As a result, they were usually avoided. It was much more common for castles to be taken through trickery, betrayal, or simple attrition. The attackers would cut off all access routes, starving the garrison of food and water. They would simply wait until hunger and disease forced the defenders to surrender. This method was slow, but it was highly reliable. Undermining was another popular tactic. Sappers would dig a tunnel beneath the castle wall, supporting the ceiling with wooden props. They would then set fire to the props, causing the structure above to collapse, creating a breach in the wall. And of course, there was always the hope of bribing one of the guards to open the gates under the cover of darkness. A direct assault was always a last resort, used only when all other methods had failed. The myth persists that the Middle Ages were simply a period of stagnation and decline, the infamous Dark Ages sandwiched between the glorious classical era and the vibrant Renaissance. This label was actually coined by Renaissance humanists, who used it to emphasize the brilliance of their own time by contrasting it with the perceived gloom that preceded it. In reality, the Middle Ages were a crucial period defined by massive change and innovation. This era saw the birth of universities, the development of Gothic architecture, and the invention of mechanical clocks, eyeglasses, the magnetic compass, gunpowder, and printing technology. Agriculture, in particular, underwent a true revolution. This was driven by key developments like the heavy-wheeled plough, the modern horse collar, which dramatically increased efficiency, and the introduction of the three-field crop rotation system. These innovations significantly boosted crop yields, making it possible to feed Europe's rapidly growing population. While we cannot ignore the true tragedies of the era, such as devastating plagues and brutal wars, to dismiss an entire 1,000-year span of history as merely dark is a deeply unfair and inaccurate oversimplification. So, what have we learned today? Vikings weren't the horned barbarians of legend, but rather clean, sophisticated traders and explorers. Pirates were less romantic treasure hunters, brandishing maps, and more pragmatic businessmen operating under a strict labour contract. And those shining suits of knightly armour often concealed motives that were far from noble. Their code of chivalry frequently existed only on the pages of fictional romances. We've seen that real history is far more complex, multifaceted, and honestly, much more fascinating than those tired old Hollywood cliches. The truth about the past isn't a simple black and white image, but a complex mosaic of facts, where every single piece changes the overall picture. Thank you so much for sticking with this deep dive, right until the very end. If you enjoyed busting these myths with us, Please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future episodes. And of course, don't forget to ring the notification bell. Now for the main question, which of these 50 myths surprised you the most? Or perhaps you know of another historical misconception we failed to mention. I look forward to reading your stories in the comments below.